if you're already filming.
We're rolling.
Oh, we're rolling.
We always do a soft roll.
Might as well.
Soft roll. We might as well have a mic correctly. What was I thinking?
Occasional writing.
Oh yeah, I think, I see a lot now in a certain form of, particularly, say, kind of internet-inflected writing. There's a sort of, we're in this weird split between the kind of moment of the think piece, which I find really horrible, where like it's supposed to as if the most recent episode of True Detective is supposed to kind of be an imperative towards thought, right?
Or even the fact that it's only, like, who would review a book chapter by chapter?
Precisely. So there's that, yes, this very weird piecemeal logic, but there's also, I think, this strange sense that, and I see this especially as someone who kind of still, writes on film a fair amount of the time, is that there's this strange idea that we're reviewers in some way, and that it matters that, I have an opinion about the 10 best films of the year or the like, and the fact is that for me, and I think for a lot of people, that doesn't remotely correspond to the experience of time and historical time that I have with cinema, right? I mean, for me, a sort of 1933 pre-code melodrama is in a way sort of as present as something that I go and see because they're kind of, I'm going to torrent both of them, right? And there's a sort of immediacy of the copy, which is sort of an obsession through a lot of my work. I mean, obviously the Violent X is in a sense about this problem of copying and sort of historical flattening, but it's all to say the occasional writing, I think, is one way for me to try to think of avoiding, either the think piece or something that only waits, like for book scale, right?
Oh, yeah,
So I'm sort of interested in this sort of in-between form. Don't get me caught.
So how did you decide to work with Taku on?
Taku and I met in...
Well, I should say before we even get into that, what did you think of last night's performance?
To be honest, I couldn't see
I
anything.
heard a lot of people said that.
So, I obviously think Taku is brilliant. That's why we're working together. But I couldn't really see. I would have loved to. There were sort of glimmers of this shadow play that I would have loved to see, but honestly, I couldn't see.
Well, I'm wondering because a few people say that, and I mean, there's some of his recorded works that are performative, but you don't see it.
Yeah,
so like I was thinking about...
It might be, but I've seen a different iteration of a sort of box performance, and there was a sort of threat to visibility in that as well, but it was very different. It was staged where we met in Glasgow. We were both at this festival, this thing called Arika there, he was doing a performance and I was doing a sort of lecture performance, sort of hybrid thing. And the version he did of it there was quite remarkable because it was set in this long sort of stage space where we were all sitting almost on bleachers with a large gap between this. And it was this very interesting kind of dusk half light you can't make out, which is actually in a way I think why he and I became friends and collaborators, is this obsession with not sort of blackness but gray as sort of a fundamentally more interesting concept of horror. But, he had this sort of remarkable half-light, and what was so interesting is this, the number of boxes was huge, sort of looked like 100 or something like that, and in this light, it took on the character of a sort of planetary city, this sort of enormous sort of geotraumatic, as people say, scale, and you couldn't actually tell if it was him moving through. It looked at times as if there was someone scaling a rope, and then you realize it's sort of, as far as I know, these sort of sandbags kind of attached to ropes as if sort of bodies looming through and knocking it down. So I was really blown away by that performance, and that's why I was sort of excited to work with him. And then, the more practical reason is we have a love of the same sort of pulpy sci-fi, and John Carpenter is a major touch point for us, both in a really kind of serious way. A novel that I wrote recently sort of hijacks Snake Plissken from Escape from New York and transposes it to him at 73 years old and relatively senile and sent back to Venice, just been turned into a maximum security prison, just trapping all the tourists there overnight without warning. And he's sent in one more time. So I think for both Taku and I, we have a strange straddling, maybe not that strange, between broadly speaking experimental traditions, although I don't find that word very useful, but so to speak, kind of experimental traditions, and then sort of pulp and Z-grade cinema and things like that. I mean, a lot of the film work, that I'm doing now and Violent X is a real product of, I think, is an attempt to join sort of two senses of the idea of paracinema, or the paracinematic, right? On the one hand, there's sort of older sense of it emerging is that which is, let's say, kind of linked to certain forms of structuralist filmmaking or expanded cinema and attention to the kind of apparatus that surrounds the spectacle of cinema. But then there's the version that you get people like Joan Hawkins picking up, which is, right, that sort of trash aesthetics and that which is on the kind of margins of the official film industry. And in a way, this film is an attempt to think about paracinema, but through a kind of different register, which has much more to do with, let's say, the kind of actual structures and circuits through which the cinema has happened, right, over the course of a century. And so this is why it is set in this particular moment using these particular source films. 1973 to 1977, roughly, about 100 films in this subgenre. What the Italians call a filone, means like a thread or a vein, I think, in an interesting way, like mining. So you kind of mine the vein until it's gone. And what it basically was, this one's called the poliziotteschi, the cop films, and you have very low budget, low scale producers who often lasted only one film, or they get a bit of Turkish co-production money. And this was during an era where working class viewership of cinema in the theater was really hemorrhaging, right? Like by 1977, only 17% of all working class women in Italy had gone to the cinema even once in the last year, right? So there's this real sense of like a kind of devastation of that being a kind of public, kind of communal experience. And these films, in a way, are this sort of desperate attempt by these small producers to cash in on what remains of that, on these sort of vanishing spaces. So that's the sort of, in a sense, the kind of fundamental material, both visual that this is drawn from, consisted of about 5,500 stills, kind of individually gathered and then reanimated from this one very tight cycle of film.
And is the in the literature surrounding it, you mentioned conspiracy. Is that something that's in the films themselves, or is that something that's coming out of the assemblage that you're creating?
Both, although more the latter. I mean, dodging spoiler alerts. I mean, in the sense well, I'll start this way. The films they're drawn from, I find them very fascinating because they are, on the one hand, and unmistakably, really proto-fascist, extremely misogynist, very nasty, sort of criminalizing films, right? They really do have this understanding of criminality as a sort of essence, a sort of vile essence to be rooted out. It starts to tip over in weird moments with the film like Born as a Man, Die as a Cop by Deodato, who did Cannibal Holocaust. And in his, this sort of fundamental sadism of the cops becomes, a little more unmistakable, and it starts to be sort of autophagic. But for the most part, they're really nasty films. I find them compelling, but they're horrible. All the same, they are, in a strange sense, simply because they're made for very little money, and if you want to film a chase scene, you're going to film in the outskirts of the city where there's no real-life cops that are going to bother you, right? This sort of this wild zone. So despite being about as far from any sort of neo-realist ethos or what people like Ettore Scola were doing in those years, the films are actually this sort of incredible document of proletarian spaces, right? And these sort of these zones that weirdly were never filmed as widely as through the 100 of these. If we take them as a unified object and look at them differently, they carry within them these sort of traces of a time. So in a way, that's the sense of conspiracy that I'm drawing out in these films, and doubling back on the production history of themselves. So basically it centers around, you could say, one character, but also one actor, this man named Maurizio Merli, who was in loads of these things. I think 13 was the count, in which he plays only twice exactly the same character. Otherwise, it's a kind of loose figure of the sort of commissario, the sort of inspector. And, basically the way that much of these films were made is you had a few sort of touch points that had done quite well. Earlier ones, like by Enzo Castellari, kind of more famous now because Tarantino jazzed about him, of course. But also later things like Death Wish and Dirty Harry kind of filtered in. And the only way people could guarantee good box office returns were two things. One was trying to make hyper-local films. So the title Violent X is sort of riff off the fact that you had, I think it's about 20 of these 100 films that use the name of a specific city in the title so as to guarantee better box office returns. And this actually happened. So you have Violent Torino, Violent Naples, Violent Rome, Milan Fears, Milan Trembles, etc., right? It kind of, the weirdest one, Napoli Serenata Calibro 9, Naples Serenade Caliber 9, which joins Di Leo with pre-war Neapolitan Sceneggiata, which is like sung melodrama. It's incredibly weird.
It's like their bullet ballet.
Totally, but yeah, it involves actually this remarkable sort of fat Neapolitan melodrama singer tracking down acrobatic thugs, and sort of while he kind of haunts them with his voice and bursts out of closets. Really, can't be made up. But so yeah, the way these producers tried to survive and profit off this sort of weird kind of remnant of mostly working class men's film going was to either make it really local or to, of course, cash in on a template that was recognizable. And the most explicit form that takes is the figure of the cop, right, the central cop. And so you have these sort of bad imitations of earlier versions, right? They all sort of, there's this sort of Bronson mustache, Franco Nero has that's picked up in Merrily, Richard Hamilton, etc. Luc Miranda, they have the same hair, the same clothes. So there's a way in which what I'm doing is using that actual production history, right, of people trying to sort of game the industry in the last moments of something like mass cinema going, using that to form the narrative conspiracy of the film, which centers around a cop who realizes that there are not just one, but perhaps a sort of extensive horde of copies of him that are out there sort of pursuing their own versions of justice and sort of turning Italy into a total bloodbath. So the actual fact of repetition in these films as source materials generates this plot. It's just sort of born of that.
And you mentioned the historical trace, and how much of that is a kind of periodization or maybe a determinism, or how much of it is present in these films? Like something like
a great question.
The social, like now especially, it seems like that's a period that's pitted against May '68 as being a little, some people are saying, more effective.
I've written, a lot of my film work comes out of also this sort of theoretical and scholarly work. I wrote a dissertation sort of about this period, so the film is really born of this research. I'll say one thing about sort of '68, and maybe this will explain about my sense of kind of historical trace, which is that, so the Italians had a really interesting word they used, which was maggio strisciante, and what that means is a creeping May, rather than like May '68, boom, and then we're post-lapsarian, and sort of vagaries of French theory are largely informed by this. The Italians didn't really have a May '68 because they had like a '62 and a '63 and a '63 and a '65, right? This sort of constant building from the Piazza Statuto riots in 1962 until kind of the end of the movement of '78, right? And so what interests me about that is this sort of idea of the creeping, which is something I've tried to sort of extrapolate a bit from that to ask more broadly, what do we think about a form of sort of determination or sort of correspondence that doesn't have this logic of that's political, we can identify it, what speaks to that, right? The creeping is, in a sense, that which only when taken as aggregate without punctual moments do things take on significance. So as to the question of like how are we looking towards the sort of traces in these films, there are these sort of explicit elements like graffiti, right? And it's always interesting, there's times where it seems like production assistants were asked to do that to make the film look more contemporary. There's other parts where it actually just is in the landscape as they're in the middle of a kind of 100-mile-an-hour car chase. You kind of, if you're watching them frame by frame like I do, you sort of catch a glimmer of that. But, that would be, if we only looked for that, that would be to bind it back to an understanding of politics as that which happens out in the open, right? And happens at moments where we can declare as public and sort of incendiary. And, the research I've done this period, and a lot of translations I've done of Italian kind of communist feminism of that time, sort of wages against and for housework campaign. I've sort of thought a lot around that, and what you have emerging from that is a real attempt to disavow a certain grasp of politics as predicated on, let's say, a gap between the public and the private, right? Politics is fundamentally, in that conception, fundamentally theatrical. It's concerned with appearance, and in that sense, the capacity to be quantified and counted. There's that strange doubling, let's say, between the march, however radical its goals, and voting at the end of the day. There's a sort of visibility, and I'm interested in traditions that have been predicated, let's say, as I talk about in Violent X, not on fire but on smoke and on fog, right? So there's the film sort of stages internally this shift away from fires that are spotted by cops to smoke, which sort of veils the possibility of where things are actually happening and kind of ruins the idea that we must bear ourselves to the state in order to become kind of accountable.
So does that mean, but you still mentioned the kind of iconography that exists, like it's still visible at some level, or
absolutely. Well, it's visible in an extremely hamstring way. Yeah. So, for example, there is only, as far as I know in these films, and I've seen pretty much all of them that are findable, you only get one depiction of a strike, sort of explicit political, and here's a strike, and that's only used because there's a killer hiding in the midst of it, sort of implying that, because it's a very conservative film in a way, like, that's the correct place for him, they protect him, he's a union member, he's a radical, but he's also a killer. This is La Polizia Ringrazia, it's an early one by Steno. Other than that, like, these things are sort of ancillary. You get Mao graffiti, you get sort of people set up as sort of capellone, like long hair hippies, but any sense of the real, what I see is the kind of compelling aspect of the 70s, and in terms of what you're saying, like why some people say it's more effective, I mean, I would say that was much more serious. I think it's probably the most serious period of sort of extended social war in the global north since maybe like the 19-teens, probably, in terms of its duration and scope, and especially in terms of what the real questioning of what got to count as political. So people have talked about like the self-production movement, which involved people setting new prices, the occupation of housing, the setting up of schools, the involvement especially of women, sort of the emergence of militant queer groups. I mean, insofar as we have an understanding of sort of an attack on capital or the sort of undoing of it as the destruction of a set of imposed categories, socially reinforced categories. In that sense, I mean, I think the period's very remarkable. That said, you still see internal to that a huge degree of sort of self-policing about what got to count as that, right? I mean, the sort of attack on the nascent feminist movement by sort of, groups that, let me put it this way, it's not until they're attacking the women that it becomes clear that they are like men's movements, right? Yeah. Even though they're putatively working class as such. So there's that, and that was a hard question I was thinking about while making this film, is how do I address this? Because this sort of iconography is not in the film in a certain sense. Like, these are, although they pick up traces, it's really not present. And so the way this is sort of formally handled and processed is an understanding of that which truly can't be shown. So there's a figure of this sort of undetermined ghost of sorts, who's sort of in a Carpenter reference, much like the sort of transmission beamed back from the future in Prince of Darkness. He's sort of like a tachyon cyberpunk, well, he's the mirror shaded figure, but who's sort of an echo of Carlo Pisacane, sort of Italian revolutionary, and not in any explicit way, but what he sort of serves as is a way to really address, let's say, the limitations of thinking about these forms of sort of undoing and struggle when all you have to work with are the iconography of the cop, given from the cop's perspective. So there's a real sort of straining at that, right, at the limits of what can I show from a set of materials that are, for all intents and purposes, cop's eye view, and the only thing that allows that degree of lability and sort of porousness where you can, I think, see sort of historical tension is both the fact that there's so many of them and that they were made so quickly. So there's a kind of sloppiness, a kind of open weave that perhaps let some of this slip through.
I'm curious if by engaging with it artistically or even just theoretically now, does it not calcify it to some extent? Does it not like kind of turn it into a totem and then maybe remove?
Yeah, this is the endless, it's I think an open question. My hope in, as someone who also, as mentioned, works on translating stuff from this, is to have a version that I hope will be of use to people in some way. I mean, I do know that, the one thing I will say is of this tradition, we have a certain image of it, of that moment, that wide historical moment, let's say broadly speaking, the kind of Anglo-American sort of reception of it, and also I'd say the French, is based on a very restricted set of materials. So for example, in the US, the understanding this is still very conditioned by this sort of post-autonomia moment, right? By like what Negri became, by Lazzarato, by Virno, the sort of post-workerists, right? And that sort of backtracks to this. We have that, and then we have an image of sort of street fighting. And in terms of actually what people were really thinking and struggling with, a lot of that is not available. I learned Italian specifically to read this stuff. It was not translated. I thought it mattered. I knew people I respected for whom it mattered a lot, and I wanted to. And in digging into that, what I found is a lot of the most compelling materials are less sexy. You don't get the sort of nice Negri lines about like, oh, when I put on the balaclava, I feel the warmth of the workers' movement. You don't have that, but you get this really remarkable effort to kind of think deeply about, let's say, what has transformed since moments when more foundational grasps of a kind of antagonist communist thought would be, and you really see that in the 50s until the 70s, a sense to kind of rethink that from the ground up. Very difficult ways. People like Romano Alquati, this sort of militant sociologist, have been translating. The work is very dense, sort of workers' inquiry studies of Fiat factories and Olivetti, but what emerges from it is this sort of, I think, almost unseen grasp of the way in which we have to think of the process of communism not as a retreat from capital, but a sort of hijacking of the circuits already established, and not in the way that was understood before as the kind of taking over of the means in some way. I mean, this is why the current research project I'm doing is a new history of sabotage. That's what I've been kind of working on this year. So this is really born of an experience of thinking about those decades in a particular tradition.
What do you think of Tiqqun, or the what is it, the coming
insurrection / invisible committee? I have it's always a hard thing. I mean, the original Tiqqun texts, I think, are the rare combination of sort of really striking and also kind of lovely. I mean, this sounds maybe irrelevant, but I don't think it is. That they have a commitment to a sort of force of expression that I think is somewhat rare in certain, let's say, kind of contemporary communist movements taken in the broad sense. I mean, I have certain, I don't know how much we want to get into this. I have certain sort of quibbles, theoretical with it. I think it largely has to do with what Jacques Camat, a kind of French left communist thinker, earlier, and sort of part of their tradition in a way, what he talked about is kind of gang logic, which is the sort of self-reinforcing tautology of certain radical groups. And my worry about the reception of Tiqqun, not so much the texts themselves, but the reception abroad, is that it has a certain grasp that sort of, it's a certain immediacy, right? There's the understanding that, like, as if all who confront the world and grasp it in this way must necessarily feel this way and therefore join, and there's not a sense of the difficult transmission or sort of spread of these ideas. There can be a sort of quite properly romantic flash of insight, as if you see this and then one is impelled to sort of torch the suburbs. And I think, what their thought did, however, I mean, this is the side that is really important, towards an especially spatial grasp of capital. I mean, they explicitly avoid engagement or the language of a more Marxist tradition, which I'm sort of unapologetically am part of, but I think this grasp of the sort of territory and terrain character of contemporary capital is really important and is a really necessary rejoinder to certain fantasies of we're all post-state and immaterial now. I mean, this is an enormous lie, I think, in certain ways propagated often by well-meaning lefty theorists who look at the conditions of their own lives and the precarity of, so to speak, of their labor as designers and writers, and something that I can sympathize with in that way. But I think there's a nasty extrapolation from a certain set of conditions towards saying, okay, this is the state of capital now, and leaves out the fact that for every phone that allows one to kind of do diffuse affective labor, there is this unbelievable material labor of still extracting from earth and smelting and shipping, right? There's a sort of sense of this deep material underpinning that remains beneath any idea of the sort of diffuse subject or sort of networks more broadly. So I maybe am always just more interested in realizing that, in attending to, let's say, the material and real brutal physical fallout, largely borne overwhelmingly by the global south, of what we can kind of fetishize as sort of a new subjectivity.
And with this, what is the spatial component? Because with the stills that you're using, we have an understanding with montage of a contiguity of like a creation of space that happens. So how are you approaching this subject matter in a spatial way?
Well, there's because these films are often shot, if not in the exact same city or neighborhood or street, but a sort of character of that in order to preserve, again, their generic placement, and therefore to kind of keep audiences on the page and therefore able to kind of watch distractedly. There is a real similarity to many of the spaces. But yeah, the space, I would say, becomes more joined by gesture than by actual contiguity. So there's a sense in which, the film, the kind of a conspiracy of gesture becomes very important, as sort of, or as linking, I guess, what I was just saying, a very material network, right, of sort of similarities proliferates across and actually allows for the crossing of different. So absolutely, in terms of, much of what happens in the film, the one is leaping between years and space, etc., but it's joined by certain sort of diagonal linkage. And then there's also the question of the sound, which sort of produces a unified space. So there's a sort of continuity of both voice throughout, because it's sort of a narrated film in a way, but also, of course, Taku's really remarkable score for it sort of joins this sonically, but in terms of the linkage between frames, I mean, they're quite literally, there's no continuity even between frames. You could say that there never is, but there really isn't in this, because insofar as they're all individually hand gathered, like there's never at any moment in the film, the stills that are gathered is never taking a section of video, frame, advance one frame and grab that, right? They're all sort of missing frames, so to speak, and reanimated from that. So that's to say that the elements I grab are based on a principle of gesture, not of sort of a continuity of real action. They're kind of treated as individual frames that are only secondarily restored to motion. A sort of comment Agamben makes, and he's not, although, via Tiqqun, there's a sort of interesting echo. He's not largely a hugely important thinker for me, but he does make a comment in one of his brief sort of moments of speaking about cinema, where he does, I think in a very correct way, say we have this strange sense where it's only once you have mechanical vision do we have the idea of organic motion, right? It's, it's something that it doesn't exist as a concept until you have that which parcels it up into a set of frames. And that's something I've kind of thought a lot about, is this relationship to a sort of the way in which we never have a grasp of what sort of flows naturally until you could say that it's been broken up in that way. So the film is sort of an attempt to gather that sort of missing natural motion and sort of throw it out the window in a way, leaving instead a set of errors, glitches, and especially the sort of low-level decay that happens, or noise that happens when you have films that were not well preserved and were never archived. Often the only copy we have is a VHS transfer, which somebody, color corrects in a kind of not very good way, and often changes the aspect ratio and puts it into video, and then that's uploaded and you download from that, right? And so one of the formal elements of the film that became really important in terms of the space as well, in the screen space, is that the fact that there's no uniform preservation, or no one's put out like a kind of unified box set of these things. What you have is extremely different renderings of aspect ratio, right? Where some are presented widescreen, some not. And so I used that to basically produce a set of sort of masks and overlays that are nothing that I've manipulated. Nothing in the film has been rescaled in any way whatsoever, but because of how, quite literally a laptop screen will process different aspect ratios, it produces these sort of thin strips of landscape that sort of hang over that. So that's the other kind of sense of space at work here, is the sense of a screen space that sort of for me, interestingly non-thought through ways. Someone's just like making a quick torrent of this to upload. It's like, whatever, that's fine, here we go, it's that. And then when I access these materials, they are now irrevocably that. You can't undo them from there, right?
Well, it's also interesting because the clock was, one thing that really bugged me was the changing of aspect ratios to have like a unified vision of...
Are you talking about the Marclay?
Yeah,
totally. No, absolutely. Got pieces everywhere. No, but I absolutely agree. I think that's... I won't badmouth that piece. Well, no, maybe I will for a second. I think what's strange about that work is exactly what you mentioned, and that for me is an index of what feels weird watching. Is it really feels like someone has an idea, and it's a quite nice one. I kind of quite like that idea, but rather than being a work or an idea born out of a form of long watching where you slowly gather this, it has the feeling of sort of having the money to have a lot of research assistants that you send out looking for these. And that's not a problem about people having money to produce work. Good for them if they can. But it does actually inflect the character of that. Precisely, you get a sort of flattening of it. And it does feel like you can read in it this sense of the idea came in a certain way, and then you simply send people out to gather these times. And the work I've been doing on this, for better or worse, has a very different character to something that in certain ways has a sort of similarity to this.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, like working with found footage, gathering specific elements, but it's sort of very much a product of a kind... But I'd like to think, as coming back to your question about traces, that this comes out of the sort of things you notice when you watch a lot of this, rather than what I sought to find in them. There's a way in which when you spend a lot of time in these, the elements that become interesting are often quite different from what you may have expected within them. Noticing, for example, the way people close their eyes after firing a gun in a sort of single moment, becomes these sort of very small gestures that only by stepping through frames do you sort of very slowly do you start picking up on, again, this sort of strange diagonal resonance that I think allows for a somewhat unified space to emerge, despite it being a kind of utter mishmash.
How would this relate at all to Salvage Funk? Would this be a gesture in that direction, or is it something that's expanded beyond?
Yeah, I mean, when I was writing about that in the book, I mean, that was initially a real... I'd say it's sort of two things. On the one hand, it was a very basic attempt to say, I have noticed a sort of diffuse cultural trend, but that really across, as I mentioned there, from like Merz and Schwitters on, but that we really can see has been taking on more and more steam of late. Although that's sort of an anti-steampunk trajectory as well. So that was a horrible unintentional pun. But yeah, it was an attempt to sort of say, I've been noticing this. I haven't found a compelling account of what exactly is underpinning this, in the same way that we've seen, something like cyberpunk did theorize, I think in a very correct way, its own relation to a set of kind of long-scale historical processes. So there was that. And then on the other hand, there is this broader sense of trying to think about what is the basic operation of salvage. I mean, it is a fundamentally historical concept, one bound up deeply with histories of empire and race, also bound to a certain relation to property, as I discussed, like the shift from that which you're paid to save something from being destroyed, to, as you enter the 19th century, that which is sort of culled from the waste heap, often of bodies, quite literally. So, there was an attempt to think about, this question of what qualities of things emerge via their brokenness and being kicked out of the circuit of value, and even perhaps reuse. And so in a way, there was, a broad use of these films, and so of course they have a kind of cultish fan audience that in a way I've definitely been part of. But you could say that attending to these little traces and gestures within them is broadly speaking an element of that. I mean, it's of course not remotely a new or rare thing in people who work on a certain kind of film, like people like Abigail Child or Matthias Muller, but in a way, the other half of this Salvage project, let's say the punk has really dropped out of that. I mean, that I sort of bemoan a little bit using that term, because it's like, of course this stuff is everywhere, and I have a weird reticence towards speaking or writing of things that I've sometimes, like I don't really write about zombie stuff anymore, or about sort of salvage and sci-fi, not because I don't think it matters, but I'd like as much as possible to avoid having like a thing that I do, or maybe it's just embarrassment, who knows. But the salvage stuff is really the other side of the coin from the Sabotage work, which is to say that if this one concerns the process of that which has already been lost to use, including sort of exchange, Sabotage begins with that which is still seemingly functional, and in fact is often at the very site of the reproduction either of bodies or of goods, in a way. So there's it's sort of two parts of a wider project to think through the sort of odd and hostile properties of things that either seem sort of dead and gone or sort of in the heart of life.
They kind of overlap. There's this a phrase in there where you say mobilizing the venom in things. It seems like that could apply equally to both.
Absolutely, yeah, precisely. It's very much this attempt to think about, in the Sabotage sense, like what is born of an intimate knowledge of that which curses your life, right? I mean, what interests me so much about this is that for those who, I'll take the most typical example, which is the idea of something like factory sabotage, although in this research, I'm kind of been able to show that actually the concept overwhelmingly emerges much more from struggles against circulation, begins in sort of a Scottish dock workers strike, in 1890s, picked up the next major instance that's talked about is a Parisian train strike in 1910, and right, so this idea of it being somehow about like throwing a wrench in the gears is actually a false notion, largely via a state capture and legal codification of that. So for example, by 1920 you have anti-sabotage law in California used to attack wobblies and the like. But what interests me in all of that is that even if we go for let's say the example of like the wrench in the gears, sabotage only works, so to speak, if you're not seen while doing it, right? It runs entirely counter to this thing I was saying about kind of fire and theatricality, because it must go unseen. It must use the sort of circuits and temporal lags and spatial distribution of capital in order to sort of carry out its attack on those very things. So sabotage, I think it's one of the most demonized concepts of the 20th century. Very interestingly, already by early Bolshevik period, the word had entered Russian, and the Cheka, the early version of the Cheka, was also the anti-sabotage unit, right? So it very quickly goes from a specific form of resistance to becoming this sort of image of the kind of vile, underhanded, conspiratorial, awful kind of not fighting fair, so to speak, right? And then it drifts into military use and becomes now to the point where you can talk about like sabotaging your relationship or your yoga or whatever people do. And the thing that's striking for me about it is that from the start it has both this form that veils with kind of smoke and fog, so to speak. It kind of remains opaque to sight, but also that it really comes from those who have an intimate knowledge of a situation, right? It's not a fantasy of a sort of return to a lost sort of species being in any way, or sort of, oh no, we have to get back to our human essence. It's like, no, one fights a war on time by means of knowing intimately the circuits that dictate how we use our time, right? And knowing the little fails, the little points of friction that only come from having to do this shit day in, day out. And I would include that, you know, in things extremely far from factories. I mean, it's entirely like affective and care labor wholly functions this way, the notion of kind of distribution of waste and the kind of circulation of goods. So broadly speaking, you know, sabotage for me is a sort of conspiratorial intimacy with the very thing you want to ruin. A sort of cunning in that way, what Détienne Vernant picked up as, from the Greek is métis, this sort of cunning knowledge, the trap logic.
And does that pertain to Violent X? And maybe specifically, how do you and Taku kind of discuss the project? Because seeing his performance last night, you mentioned curse when you were talking about Sabotage. Like he used the word curse, catastrophe, and then also this 1,000 years. Like it seems like there's a similarity in how you're approaching.
Yeah, I mean, at the most basic level, we have a real sort of affinity for a certain set of traditions that, you know, again, they're not the most rare ones, but what is rare, you know, when he and I met was a sort of immediate, just like, okay, we get it. We get how these parameters sort of click into place for us in a way. So, you know, I mean, how we worked is very simple. It's just, you know, I talked with him about it. I sent him a bunch of these films, some of which he's actually pulled audio from and it kind of appears in Violent X, this sort of echo. But then, you know, I sort of sent him the story and he started composing music and I started sort of composing and arranging these images, which I sent him, and there's sort of the sense of a dual tracking around, you know, that emerges from a sort of common understanding of that. And some of this, I think the notion of the curse, I think an interest in invisibility or sort of visible veiling. I mean, so I'm very interested in the history of camouflage, and what's so interesting with camouflage is like you have three kinds. You have cryptesis, mimesis, and dazzle. You know, cryptesis is simply like trying to hide. Mimesis is, of course, you try to look like something else and go unnoticed. And dazzle is a kind of hiding in plain sight where, you know, take the form of these sort of futuro-cubist cruisers and pink tanks in the desert. Really remarkable history. But the idea is that you don't make it look, you don't go unnoticed, but they can't get a bead on you. It produces this literal sort of shimmer in sight that can't be sort of tracked down or aimed upon. I think we're both very interested in the relation between a sort of form of historically generated nihilism and then, you know, I think there's inflection in my work. It's more explicitly linked to sort of political history. He comes out of a different set of traditions. Obviously, he's a musician and I'm not in any serious way. So, but yeah, I think the basic working process involves a real affinity and an understanding that there may be hidden within histories of pulp, not just a sort of lost good time that we should you know, my interest in these films is not, with these and any of the other films I work on, is not to drag them into the canon of cinephilia, right? That's not, I'm just not interested in having that debate. It's not how I think about cinema. You know, for me, cinema is the name of a historical problem that far exceeds film. Right, it's a basic question about the relationship between the accumulated and the mobile, and I think, you know, it's much more linked to the history of rent and architecture than to theater in any way, you know. And so when I want to draw these up, it's not to say, oh, actually these are really great films, or that I want to make a kind of great film out of them and therefore honor them. It's nothing to do with this. It's simply a thought that within what was often made sort of cheaply and without trying to be historical, that might be the place where you capture the most interesting materials. You know, I mean, I think there is a weird curse, to come back to that word, of people who, myself maybe included, absolutely, is, you know, who work also as historians and scholars and theorists in some way, which is that it can be really, there's a bad tendency to overthink, of course, what you're doing, right? As if everything has to sort of have a significance or tie into the architecture of these things. And making this film has been a real process of learning to kind of try to put a hold on that to a certain degree and to sort of treat amongst these thousands and thousands of images forms of sort of natural or unexpected contiguity that kind of leap out of me, a sort of flash of that, and to maybe think that within there's something of much more interest than any theoretical apparatus I could have would be able of sort of making happen.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's a real pleasure.